A black woman in her early 30s steps into the courtroom, her heels clicking softly against the polished floors, the room filled with the murmur of other defendants and attorneys waiting for their turn at the bench. She walks with quiet confidence, her posture straight and her expression calm. She wears a simple dark suit, but there's an air of authority about her that immediately sets her apart from the other people gathered there. As she approaches the bench, the judge barely notices her, at first his eyes scanning through a pile of paperwork. Without looking up, he speaks in a voice that carries the weight of years spent on the bench, ordering people around with little more than a glance. The room is filled with the hum of conversation as people await their turn, but the judge is already on autopilot. He doesn't bother to study the woman who stands before him, the way she carries herself or the precision in her movements. He doesn't look beyond the surface. He's seen thousands of cases like hers before. A minor infraction, a little paperwork, a fine to be paid. He assumes she's no different than the others who have passed through this courthouse. Before her, he focuses on the paperwork in front of him, which lists the nature of the violation. The woman was caught driving without a valid registration. Her car was pulled over by a patrol officer, and after a brief exchange, a citation was issued. In his mind, this is just another case, another minor inconvenience in his day. As he speaks, his words are clipped as though he said them 1,000 times before. The fine will be $150, a small amount, but enough to make a statement. The woman doesn't react, at least not outwardly. Her eyes remain fixed on the judge, her hands resting neatly at her sides. She doesn't argue, she doesn't flinch. She simply nods once, acknowledging the judge's words, but saying nothing in return. Her expression remains unreadable, as though she's heard it all before and knows exactly how to play this game. She remains poised and composed. Something about the way she stands makes the judge uncomfortable, but he brushes it off too quickly to give it any real thought. His gaze moves on to the next case, already dismissing her from his mind. The room is still buzzing with activity. As the woman turns to leave, she walks with the same quiet confidence, but now there's something almost unsettling in the way she moves. It's as though she doesn't quite belong here, and yet she does at the same time, as though she knows this world far better than anyone else in this courtroom could possibly imagine. The judge watches her leave for just a moment, his eyes flickering over her retreating form. But before he can think too much about it, his attention is drawn back to the next case. He turns his focus to the next defendant, another routine matter, his mind already moving on, as if the woman never existed, as if she was just another face in a long line of people who pass through this courthouse every day, unaware that in just a few moments everything he thought he knew about this woman would be turned completely upside down. The judge barely notices the passing moments as he moves through the next cases. One after the other, they all blend together in a blur of routine decisions and automatic judgments. His thoughts drift from one to the next without much real consideration. But something about the woman's departure lingers in the back of his mind. It's a subtle feeling, like an itch he can't scratch. He doesn't know why it bothers him, yet it does. But he shakes it off and proceeds with his day as he issues fines and makes rulings without looking up, without engaging beyond the surface of the cases before him. He barely registers the clerk's approach as she slides a file across his desk. At first, he thinks it's just another pile of paperwork to move through the same mundane requests he's seen all day long, but something catches his eye as he flips it open. The woman's name is printed at the top of the page, and he feels the nagging feeling return. He can't shake the odd discomfort he felt when she stood before him, the way she looked at him, without saying a word, without reacting to the fine. Her calm demeanor seemed almost practiced, almost too perfect for someone caught in the middle of such a trivial infraction. But there was something else, a sharpness behind her eyes that didn't quite fit with the rest of the room. His fingers hesitate on the file as he begins to scan the details. Something doesn't sit right. It's not the fine, it's not the violation, it's the name that keeps echoing in his mind. The name he just read now begins to mean something. He looks down at the file again, and then the words jump out at him like a shock to his system. Federal prosecutor. He reads it again, federal prosecutor. The words dance across the page in front of him, and suddenly everything changes. The woman he had just dismissed so casually had been standing before him as a federal prosecutor, one of the most prestigious positions in the legal system. How had he missed it? How had he not recognized her? He feels his chest tighten, a small bead of sweat forming at the back of his neck, the reality of his mistake hitting him like a wave of cold water. Suddenly he feels exposed, vulnerable, in a way he hadn't in years. The judge sits back in his chair, staring at the file in disbelief, his heart racing as he replays the moments in his mind, how he had acted so dismissively toward her, how he had assumed she was just another defendant caught in the mundane dance of traffic court. He feels a rush of guilt begin to swirl inside him, but there's no time to wallow in it. Not when his mind is racing trying to process what this means for him, what this means for his reputation, for his position as a judge who prides himself on fairness and objectivity. And yet here he is having made a snap judgment based on the color of her skin, the way she looked, the way she carried herself, and he had gotten it all wrong. The judge's mind races as he stares at the file in front of him, the words federal prosecutor echoing like a drumbeat in his ears. How could he have been so blind? How could he have failed to see the power that stood before him just moments ago? His thoughts churn in a whirlwind of self-reproach and disbelief. He had assumed so much about her based solely on her appearance, her calm and collected mannerisms, the way she carried herself in the courtroom, the way she didn't argue or protest. When he issued the fine, he thought she was just another driver paying the price for a small mistake. But now everything about that assumption feels wrong. Every moment of dismissal, every word of condescension burns in his mind, and the weight of it settles heavily on his chest. He leans back in his chair, his hands trembling slightly as he tries to steady his thoughts. He's a judge, a man who's supposed to be above all bias and assumptions, yet here he is caught in a trap of his own. Making the realization that he had let his own prejudices influence his decisions fills him with disgust. He's supposed to be impartial above all else, but he had allowed his judgments to be clouded by things he couldn't even admit to himself. The woman's calmness in the face of a fine, no argument, no resistance, no protest. It was as if she knew exactly what was happening, as if she had already seen this play out in her head and knew there was nothing to fear. There's a brief flash of doubt. Does she know that he's realized the mistake? Has he made a fool of himself in front of someone so powerful? The thought sends a chill through him, and he sits up straighter, his mind racing to find a way to fix the situation. But the more he thinks, the more he realizes that there's nothing he can do. The damage has been done. All the apologies in the world won't undo the judgment that has already been passed. He runs a hand through his hair and glances at the clock. Time seems to be moving at an agonizingly slow pace. Now, he can't shake the feeling that he's being watched even though there's no one in the room. With him, the walls feel like they're closing in. His confidence shattered by the knowledge that he had just fined a federal prosecutor for something so trivial, so beneath the weight of her position. How had he not recognized her when she first walked in? He's seen her name before, heard it in passing on the news or in legal circles, but he had never imagined she would be standing right in front of him in his courtroom, dressed in a suit with nothing more than a minor violation to her name. He feels the heat of embarrassment rising in his cheeks, but there's no one to witness it, no one but the cold, indifferent paper in front of him, reminding him of his failure. He stares at the file for a long moment, as if hoping the words will change or that he can somehow undo the situation, but nothing shifts and the truth settles over him with a brutal clarity. The judge stares at the file for what feels like an eternity, his hands gripping the paper as if holding it could somehow steady the overwhelming storm inside him. He rereads the woman's name again and again, his eyes tracing the words as if trying to will them to disappear, but they stay fixed on the page. Federal prosecutor. He shakes his head in disbelief. How had he not recognized her when she first walked in? Why had he not noticed the composure, the quiet authority, the way she seemed different from the other defendants he had encountered that morning? His mind replays the moments in the courtroom, her stillness, her lack of reaction to his words, her sharp gaze that had unsettled him, but he hadn't allowed himself to dwell on it at the time. He had been too focused on the task at hand, issuing fines, making judgments without giving much thought to the people behind the cases. But now it's all different. Now that he knows who she is, and the weight of that knowledge presses down on him, heavier than any fine could ever do. He stands abruptly, pacing around the room, his mind a blur of frustration and guilt. He feels trapped by his own mistakes, trapped by his assumptions, his biases that he hadn't even realized were there until now. The worst part is he knows he can't take back the fine, he can't undo what has been done, and that realization stings like a slap in the face. His reputation as a judge is supposed to be based on fairness and impartiality, but in this moment, he realizes just how far he's fallen from that ideal. The irony is crushing. He had always prided himself on his ability to see through the surface, to judge the facts and the law, not the people standing before him. But here he is failing to do just that. His own preconceived notions and prejudices had clouded his judgment, and now he's left to deal with the fallout. But it's not just about his reputation, it's about the woman herself and the injustice he's just done to her. He wonders what she thinks of him, what she must have seen in him when she stood before him with that calm expression, her silence now feels loaded with meaning, like she knew exactly what he was doing and allowed it to play out anyway. Perhaps she had seen through him before he'd even opened his mouth. He wonders if she's angry, if she's planning to do something about it, but the thought of facing her again fills him with dread. He knows he will have to speak with her to apologize, but he doesn't know how. He doesn't know what to say. How does one apologize for an assumption so deeply ingrained? How does one take back the damage done in a moment of ignorance? The clock on his desk ticks loudly in the quiet room, and the sound only makes him feel more isolated, more aware of the space between him and the woman who had been so easily dismissed moments ago. He tries to push the thoughts aside, but they keep coming back again and again. The look in her eyes, the way she stood there like she was already a step ahead of him, and the cold reality that she had been right all along. The judge sits back down, his heart still pounding in his chest as he stares at the file with the woman's name still burning in his mind. He can't shake the feeling that he's made a huge mistake, and it's too late to undo it. The room feels too small, too claustrophobic. Now his mind racing as he tries to figure out what he's supposed to do next. How does he fix this? How does he approach her without making it worse? His thoughts jumble together as he tries to come up with some way to atone for his lapse in judgment, but nothing seems to make sense. No words seem to fit the weight of what he's done. Part of him knows he'll never be able to make it right, that the stain of this moment will follow him forever. He thinks about the power she must hold, how easily she could expose him, how easily she could turn the tables and make him look like a fool. He doesn't know if she'll do it or if she'll just let it slide, but he knows he has no control over the situation anymore. It's all in her hands. Now the thought makes his stomach churn. He knows he should do something, anything to try to make amends, but the more he thinks about it, the more he's paralyzed by the fear of making things worse. He stands up again, this time walking across the room to the window. He needs air. He needs to think, but every thought that comes to him feels like another mistake, another way he could mess it up. He wishes he had acted differently. He wishes he had taken a moment to really look at her, to really listen to her, to stop seeing the case as just another name on a docket, to stop seeing her as a simple defendant and start seeing her as a person, someone with a life and a story, someone who didn't deserve to be judged by appearances. He rubs his temples, his head pounding. As he tries to focus, he wonders if she'll come back to the courtroom at all, if she'll just pay the fine and disappear, or if she'll return with the weight of the legal world behind her, if she'll bring her full power down on him in a way he never saw coming. The thought is enough to make him feel faint, but he tries to push it aside and concentrate on the present. He knows he needs to act now. He can't wait for her to make the next move. He needs to be proactive. He needs to find a way to fix this before it spirals out of control. He picks up the phone, his fingers hesitating over the buttons as he considers who to call. Should he contact the clerk? Should he call his colleagues for advice? Or is it better to speak to her directly? Is it better to face the consequences head on and hope she sees his remorse in his eyes and not just another person trying to save face in a moment of crisis? But as his fingers hover over the phone, he feels an overwhelming sense of dread. He can already hear the conversation unfolding in his mind, the awkwardness, the tension, the realization that it may be too late to apologize for what he's done. His thoughts return to her, the way she stood so still in front of him, so composed, so controlled. He wonders if she knew what was coming, if she had already made up her mind about him. The thought is almost unbearable. The judge finally puts the phone down. He can't bring himself to make the call. He's terrified of what will happen next. The silence in his office feels oppressive, the weight of his own thoughts pressing against him in a way that's unbearable. He can't stop thinking about her, the woman whose name now haunts him, as if she's already in control of the situation, and he's simply waiting for her to make her move. He imagines her standing in the hallway outside his office, her mind sharp and calculating as she weighs her options. He wonders if she's already decided to let it go, or if she's preparing for a confrontation. He wonders if she's laughing at him in her mind, or if she's just waiting for him to come crawling back. Her calm demeanor now feels like a mask, like she's been playing a game all along, and he was too blind to see it. He can't help but feel small in this moment, the reality of what he's done sinking in deeper and deeper with every passing second. He thinks about his career, his reputation, how much it means to him to be respected and trusted as a judge, someone who is supposed to uphold justice and fairness. He thinks about his family, how they would look at him if they knew about this mistake, if they knew how he had let his own biases cloud his judgment. He wonders if they would still look at him the same way, if they would still be proud of him, or if they would see him as just another flawed human being capable of making terrible mistakes. He takes a deep breath and tries to steady himself. He knows he can't keep running from this. He has to face it head-on, but as he stands up from his desk, he's suddenly filled with dread, his thoughts racing through 1,000 different scenarios. He wonders if he'll see her again today, if she'll come back into his courtroom, if she'll confront him directly, if she'll ask him why he did it, why he treated her so dismissively, why he failed to see her for what she truly was. He wonders if he can even explain himself, if there's any way to justify his actions, if there's any way to make this right. The more he thinks about it, the more he realizes there's nothing he can say, nothing he can do to undo the damage he's caused. But he still feels the need to act. He knows he can't just let it go. He can't just pretend it didn't happen, because that would make him no better than the person who has no awareness of their own biases, no ability to admit when they've done wrong. So he leaves his office and walks down the hallway towards the courtroom, his steps heavy as he approaches the door, his stomach tied in knots, as he wonders what he's going to do when he opens it, what he's going to say if she's there waiting for him. He hesitates for a moment outside the door, listening to the muffled sounds of voices and footsteps on the other side. The courtroom is already filling up for the next cases, but his mind is elsewhere. It's only her that matters now, only her and the judgment he's made. The judge takes a deep breath and opens the door, stepping into the courtroom, his eyes scanning the room, quickly looking for her. But she's not there yet. The usual bustle of the morning hearings continues, but he can't focus on any of it. His mind is still on the woman, the federal prosecutor, who has turned his world upside down. The weight of his mistake feels like a physical presence pressing against his chest. He makes his way to the bench and sits down, feeling the eyes of the room on him as he arranges the papers before him. But his thoughts keep drifting back to her. He wonders where she is, if she's even coming back, if she's already decided how she'll handle this, if she'll choose to stay silent, or if she'll confront him directly. His hands are sweating as he picks up the case file in front of him, his mind desperately trying to shift its focus to the next case. But all he can think of is her and the judgment he's passed, without thought, without care for who she truly was. His fingers tremble as he flips through the pages of the next file, but he can't focus. The names on the paper blur together, the words becoming meaningless, the weight of his own guilt clouding his judgment. The door to the courtroom opens again, and this time he sees her. She enters quietly, walking with the same calm assuredness he saw before, but now something is different. She's not just the defendant anymore, she's someone else entirely. She stands tall and poised, her presence filling the room in a way that catches him off guard. He can feel the eyes of the room shifting as they notice her too. Her confidence is undeniable, and yet there's a sharpness to her gaze as she looks directly at him, without flinching, without hesitation. It's as if she's already read the situation, and she knows exactly what to do next. His heart skips a beat, and his breath catches in his throat. The courtroom seems to fall silent for a moment as their eyes meet, and for the first time he feels exposed. He's not the judge in control of the room, he's the one being judged, and it's all happening in front of everyone. He feels his palms go clammy as he shifts uncomfortably in his seat. But she doesn't move toward the bench, not yet. Instead, she walks slowly toward the center of the room, her presence commanding attention, and yet she doesn't say a word. She doesn't have to. It's as though her silence speaks volumes, louder than any accusation. She waits for him to speak, to acknowledge the mistake he's made, but he can't bring himself to say anything, not yet. He feels trapped by his own guilt, caught between the desire to apologize and the fear of what her reaction might be. How could he possibly make this right? How could he explain that he had let his assumptions cloud his judgment? How could he ever undo the damage done with a few careless words? He opens his mouth, but nothing comes out. He's paralyzed in that moment, caught in the tension of their unspoken exchange. But still she waits, still she doesn't move. The silence between them stretches long enough to feel like a tangible thing, the weight of it pressing down on the judge as he watches her stand there unmoving, her eyes fixed on him, waiting for him to break the tension, to say something, anything, but he can't find the words. He's not sure what to say or how to say it, and the longer he stays silent, the heavier the air feels. He wonders if she's disappointed in him or if she's already forgiven him in a way that he can't quite understand. He feels a flush rise to his face, but she doesn't look away, her gaze steady, unwavering, and somehow he feels smaller in that moment, less sure of himself than he's ever been. He clears his throat, trying to steady his nerves, but the words still don't come out. It's as if his tongue is tangled in the knot of his guilt, his fear of making things worse paralyzing him. He can hear the rustle of papers on the bench beside him, the murmurs of the other people in the courtroom, but none of it matters. The only thing that matters is her standing there watching him, waiting for him to make a move. And he knows he can't hide from this anymore. He can't pretend this hasn't happened. But how can he fix it? How can he take back the judgment he's passed? How can he undo the damage of his assumptions? And the look in her eyes when he issued the fine, how can he show her that he recognizes the depth of his mistake? He finally forces the words out, his voice hoarse as he speaks, "I'm sorry." He pauses, searching for the right words, but they all feel inadequate. "I didn't know who you were, and I didn't take the time to understand. I misjudged you, and I've let my own biases get in the way of doing what's right. I can't undo it, but I hope you'll accept my apology." He feels his heart race as he finishes speaking. The courtroom remains quiet, all eyes on them. As he waits for her response, he watches her closely, trying to read her expression, but she doesn't give anything away. For a long moment, there's nothing but silence, and then she speaks, her voice calm but strong. "It's not about the fine," she says quietly. "It's about the judgment you made without even thinking. It's about the way you assumed something about me based on how I looked and what I seemed to be, but you didn't see me for who I am." She pauses, as if weighing her words carefully. "I'm not angry," she says. "Finally, I'm disappointed that you didn't see the person standing before you, disappointed that you didn't give me the chance to show you what I've worked for, what I've done with my life." She looks at him for a moment longer before turning away, her words hanging in the air like a challenge, something he knows he will carry with him for a long time. The judge sits there in stunned silence. He feels a mix of shame and relief wash over him, but he doesn't speak again. He knows there's nothing more he can say. She's already said everything that needs to be said. She walks out of the courtroom without another glance, and the judge watches her go, his mind spinning with the truth of her words, her disappointment echoing in his ears. As the door closes behind her, he realizes he'll never forget this moment, never forget the lesson learned at the cost of his own pride and judgment.